Hi everyone, I'm Michael Cornwall. I'm here in California taping this interview for the workshop you're at, and I wish I could have been there, but I had other obligations. But I'm very glad to be part of the workshop that is about the Mandala Project and about the spiritual dimension of extreme states or psychosis. My friends Dina, Tyler, and Cardam here from the Bay Area were part of this wonderful Mandala Project that has been active the last couple of years, and looks like we're going to be making some real gains with some programs actually starting, so I'm sure you'll hear more from them about that. Maybe I'll start off first talking about my own experience of madness or psychosis or extreme states that was about 50 years ago now. When I was a young man, I had some of the young trauma that a lot of people who start becoming in an extreme states process in their early adulthood had. I was not with my biological parents from a very early age, and my family was pretty chaotic. So at the point when the Vietnam War was going on and most of my friends were wanting to go or join the Marines, I was a pacifist and didn't want to take part in that. And I felt very isolated and depressed and was struggling. And like I say, some of the early problems from my family kind of impinged there, as they often do when people hit this kind of glass ceiling of that young adulthood, transition into young adulthood. So I was ripe for a journey into an extreme state process, and it didn't take much more than a very bad LSD trip to send me into that, which lasted on and off for about a year. And it was very intense, terrifying journey that had what I would call a spiritual element to it. It felt uncannily like I was being attacked by dark forces at times. And I had no reference point for that going into it, because I had been a materialist, empiricist, young atheist guy. And so when this happened, I was really thrown into this kind of existential crisis. The blessing for me was I didn't get caught up in the mental health system, because I had a place to be where I was safe, a sanctuary where I could be and go through this without psychiatric intervention or medication or incarceration. My aged grandmother, who was in her late 80s and was quite demented, had a place where I could stay. And I did stay there. And she was the one who had raised me from a boy. So there was very strong unconditional love from her that I received in this safe place where I could go through this. Nevertheless, the experiences I had of hearing very strong, hateful voices and the TV talking to me, and me being out raving to myself, wandering around at night, it was really awful. Many nights I would sit there with my finger on the line for the emergency room of the hospital. They didn't really have a psychiatric facility there where I lived in this small northwestern town, telling myself, if this comes a wave of this again, this kind of supercharged terror, that I'll call them for help. But I never did call them. I knew kind of instinctively that if I did, I would be caught up in this system that would identify me in a certain way, and it would be stamped on me probably for the rest of my life. So I think that's an awful situation that people face every day, of being at that crossroads of needing help and not having help that I believe are kind of the necessary and sufficient conditions, which turns out, in my opinion now, after these years and being a therapist for about 35 years, working with people in extreme states, that that loving milieu, that loving presence of at least one other person is what we need. And even so, with my grandmother's loving care, the awful kind of otherworldly experiences were unrelenting. Sometimes I didn't know where my body was in the room. It felt like I was kind of a ghostly spirit, and it was getting so bad that I felt like I may need to take my own life just to stop this. And I know of some people who have done that. Consistent with the topic of this workshop of spirituality and spiritual emergence, again, here I was, an atheist person having this, what I knew for sure was some contact with some realm of spirit that I didn't even know existed. One day at my grandmother's house, just on an impulse, there was a thin book there on the shelf that I hadn't looked at before. I pulled it out and opened it. It was a religious book, and the line that popped out at me said, "Come unto me, all ye labor and who are heavy laden, and I will give you rest." It's from the scriptures, and I'm not proselytizing today. I'm not actively in the church. Bless everybody who is, but that's just not where I'm at. But when I read those words, it was like something went right here. It was like a light went on here, almost like a jolt of energy, and it was something opened up that in this midst of this darkness that I was in, this person who was speaking those words wasn't talking about, 2 weeks rest in the Bahamas. It was the kind of rest that spoke directly to my condition, which at that point I knew was a spiritual crisis. So that turned the whole tables for me. After that, I was finally able to risk going to sleep. Almost everyone I've worked with who's gone through these extreme state processes, not sleeping is almost universal. I hadn't slept probably more than an hour or so a night for weeks. So I was able to sleep after that happened. I was able to trust that there was something benevolent in the universe that had turned dark for me. I must say there's these different layers, I think, that go into the mystery of madness that kind of supply the conditions for it to happen. We live in a culture that has been called a wasteland, a kind of a spiritually devoid, corporate dog-eat-dog world of kind of a social Darwinism where people are winners or losers, and so many people are isolated. I think that has a huge impact on the conditions that contribute to people and families floundering in this cultural milieu that we're all in. I must say too that the monomyth of our culture that says from birth we're damaged goods, that there was something happened at creation that created a fall where nature itself is corrupt and we as human beings are inherently bad. I've seen so many years and so many times in the last 35 years of people I've worked with who have struggled with that sense of not being a sacred, innocent being, but somehow a sinful, bad person. So all that was impinging on me when I went through this, and my journey out of it was not an easy one. I spent some years not in an extreme state, but kind of trying to figure out that, well, given this, what do I do with my life? And I was homeless at times on the street. And so I'm giving this kind of lengthy intro to what my story was, because I know this workshop is about people telling their stories. Dina's going to, I think they already have, and Cardam and Lauren and Lorenzo. And so I think there's something really important when we tell our stories. The sense of isolation that people go through when they're going through these extreme states is probably the worst part. Now there's so many wonderful resources that are available, nowhere near what people need. Just yesterday I was with my friend Sasha DeBrule of the Icarus Project, and the Icarus Project logo is "You are not alone." I mean, that's it. You are not alone. You can pick up the phone probably anywhere in the country now and call and talk to someone. That wasn't in place when I was going through this. I was alone, except for my grandmother's love, who she didn't know what was going on. At one point, she said, "Well, you must have the flu, dear," and kind of was comforting me that way. So from that experience, I wanted to be of some help to people who might be going through the same experience. And I ended up living in what they used to call a Jesus freak commune, people who still live in those. I stayed there for a while, and I ended up being an aspirant to the Episcopal priesthood, and was on my way to seminary, and I got diverted from that by a wise spiritual director who said I wasn't cut out for the church. So I ended up being a therapist. I went to graduate school in the Bay Area, and let me talk a little bit about sanctuaries that existed then, and that the Mandala Project is trying to get some started to be available now. In the Bay Area in the 70s and 80s, early 80s, there were actually 3 sanctuaries open at the same time. Some of you may have heard of Lauren Mosier's project in San Jose called the Soteria Project. That was kind of an offshoot of R.D. Laing's Kingsley Hall work there in London. There was also a remarkable thing happened that I'm going to tell you a little bit about the research that I think supports an alternative approach to the psychiatric medical model, and it was the research that was done under the auspices of Esalen Institute and the National Institute of Mental Health and the California Department of Mental Health. It was at the Agnew State Hospital, and Richard Price from Esalen, who'd been through his own travail when he was a young man, he was a co-founder of Esalen Institute, and I lead workshops and trainings down there. There's going to be, I'll put in a plug, there's going to be a workshop there December 12th through 14th with David Lukoff and myself, a weekend workshop on revisioning madness. Anyway, Richard Price of Esalen had this idea to have kind of a world-class NIMH study done on first episode psychosis. It was done at the Agnew State Hospital. To this day, it's the largest ever in the United States, or I think in the world actually, first episode psychosis study where randomly assigned individuals, in this case young men, were randomly assigned to one group that got antipsychotic medication, Thorazine, and the other group didn't. They both had this milieu that was developed out of Price's desire to have a more loving environment than what he went through, where he had been shocked and given all kinds of forced medications. So this project, this research, was carried out, and John Weir Perry, who went ahead after that and opened a sanctuary in San Francisco called Diabasis House, that grew out of this research. The place I worked at for 3 years, I-Ward, which was for 8 years was open, a 20-bed sanctuary. We used no medications or restraints or diagnosis. It was publicly funded. All that grew out of this Agnew's research, where the one randomly assigned group got the antipsychotic medications, the other didn't. As would be expected, the group that got the medications had rapid so-called symptom reduction. But turns out the research shows, even though they were in this kind of non-traditional, non-medical model milieu where people were giving this kind of loving receptivity, they weren't able to avail themselves of it as well as the young men who didn't get the medication. Those young men who didn't get the medication, and I think there was about 40 in each group, at 3-year follow-up, the young men who didn't get the medication had a 75% lower rehospitalization rate than the young men who did. So that was an enormous result then. And then, like I say, John Perry was able to go to San Francisco and sell that to the decision makers there, and they opened Diabasis House. A man named Stanley Marison was able to come to Contra Costa County and open the place I Ward where I was at. When you're with people in these extreme states, especially in their initial journey, with no medication, there's no doubt that psychic and spiritual and numinous things are happening. And I must say, I think part of the reason why psychiatry and our culture in general has wanted to frame the emotional suffering and madness that people go through as some physical, biogenetic disease, like they say, like diabetes or something else, that sterilizes the whole experience, it demythologizes it, and the whole history of humankind of madness being a mystery. I still believe it's a mystery, even though I've been asking myself for about 50 years, if madness isn't what psychiatry says it is, then what is it? The medical model answers that by saying, we know what it is, and all this hocus pocus about spirituality and all that, that was the Dark Ages. Well, I think when you've already heard my friend Dina's and Cardam's story and you're hearing some of mine, there is a dimension. I'm not saying it's the whole thing, but I think just in my own thoughts, to negate that and say that that isn't part of people's experience is a great loss. It's a loss to the person, but also it's a loss to our culture, because in all cultures up until the last few hundred years in our Western so-called enlightened age of reason, all cultures have seen these extreme state experiences as potential mana for the culture. The whole shamanic tradition of people going through these initiatory experiences and bringing some of that visionary experience forward for the culture to benefit from. It's always been something that's been very valued, and in our culture that's kind of flushed away, and I think it really is a huge loss. And I think it accounts for the kind of wasteland, sterile, mall America that we live in, and even other countries. So from these sanctuaries where people were allowed to go through these processes without medication, and it wasn't just about the not medication, but it was about how we viewed it, the lens we viewed it from. I mean, this I Ward where I worked was open for 8 years. It was a 20-bed facility. It was a publicly funded, with the Medicaid dollars, Medi-Cal dollars. But everyone who came in there, we just routinely, to get the money to pay for it, keep it open, because we had to diagnose everybody brief reactive psychosis. And remember, unless someone is exhibiting these so-called symptoms for 6 months, they can't earn a schizophrenic diagnosis. So our whole plan was to divert people from being in the system and not going through this process, and for them to be trapped in the system. And we found time and time again, consistent with the Agnew's Project results, of the majority of young people going through this, coming out the other side, as Carl Menninger said, weller than well. that was what we could provide, and what Diabas's house that I did my doctoral research on that had the Jungian orientation, Carl Jung, who really is someone who's an ally for anyone who's interested in the spiritual dimension of psychosis because of his own experience. You can see it in his Red Book that's available now, where he recounts his own visionary and extreme state experience. That Jungian perspective that Diabas's house kind of exclusively had, it was also present at iWard. We also had that appreciation for that numinous mythic level of people's process. You couldn't deny it, because after I'd worked there about a week, I was on probation, and I found out I'd left another job to take this one, and I realized I may not make it here because the staff was watching me for a week to see how I would relate to people in these extreme processes. Finally, about a week into it, someone came when I came to work and said, kind of solemnly, "We've decided you can do the work. Your first responsibility, your first person's in the back day room." Saying, okay, well, I guess I'm going to have a job. But I went back there. I said, well, who is it? He says, just go back and find out. I went back, and standing on a table about this high was a young woman who was totally nude, was in an ecstatic state, going, heavenly, heavenly, heavenly. She was completely in this ecstatic state, which some Thorazine or Haldol or something is going to stop really quick, but we didn't do that. When you're in the presence of something like that, it makes your hair stand on end, because there's this powerful force. I believe it's a force of nature that's present in madness or extreme states. Whether it's in this first episode dramatic time, for me it resonates even when I'm, like I was yesterday in Berkeley and seeing some poor soul on the street. I still feel this presence of a natural force that is uncivilized and uncanny, and has even someone who's been in that state for many years and is not in this dramatic upheaval. So this young woman who had that ecstatic presentation that I first saw, my first job was to get her off the table, so I got a blanket and got her to her room. And then over the course of weeks, her process was dramatically full of this, what you would call numinous spiritual power. Within a day or so, going from that benevolent kind of Saint Teresa place of her calling herself like the Virgin Mary, she shifted. She said, but now this part of me over here is growing into the daughter of Satan. And when she would do that, and she'd lean forward, and you just feel, again, your hair kind of stand on neck, that you were in the presence of something, yes, this young person, this young mother, who was plugged into these archetypal forces. So for me, if someone is in this extreme state, whether, again, it's in this acute early episode kind, or the person who's been in a long time, they're by definition, they're in an archetypal process according to my reading of Jungian theory. And so I must say that I disagree with Stan Grof's The Spiritual Emergency formulation that says there are these people who are going through this spiritual emergency over here who have all this dramatic, mythic, spiritual content going on, and then over here are the rest of the mentally ill, the people who do have a psychiatric disorder. Well, since I never believed in the validity of the psychiatric medical model, and I've had all this experience myself, and then knowing what Carl Jung went through and how he envisioned the collective unconscious that we all have going on inside of us, that everyone, by definition, if they're in an extreme state process, they're in an archetypal or a numinous or a mythic process. So some of this revisioning of what it means kind of reimagining. I think one of the main failures of psychiatry is a failure of imagination. I mean, I see all these wonderful psychiatrists. I worked in that county mental health system for 28 years, every day for 28 years. And every day I was on a treatment team with wonderful people who were psychiatrists, every day. Some of the finest people I've ever known. But they were trained and they were in the belief that they were trained into of Western medicine, that emotional suffering and madness is inherently a biological genetic disease process. Although, as we know remarkably by the head of the NIMH, Thomas Insel, I think it was last year, because there was so much, I would say, snake oil of some MDs saying that they can, with their brain imaging machine, identify 5 different kinds of depression, that Thomas Insel came out and pronounced there are no tests for anything, the major mental illnesses in the DSM. There's no biomarker, there's no blood test, there's no brain imagery testing that can give a diagnosis. So you have this huge edifice of every single dollar that's spent on mental health services in the United States, public sector or private, has to have a DSM attached to it. The DSM is basically, I think, kind of a philosophical tract of how human emotional suffering and madness is described. And then the head of the NIMH basically says, we have no tests to support what the DSM is saying is the gospel truth. So what are we left with, people who have been through these experiences ourselves, caregivers who want to provide something, provide choice? And again, let me quickly say, maybe I should have said it at the beginning, that I'm not in any way suggesting that someone who's on medication should get off their medication, and I'm not suggesting that anyone who feels like the diagnosis that they've been given really serves them, that they should discard that. I'm really talking about an alternative vision and view that ultimately I think is fair to have in place to offer people choice. So a lot of the work I've been doing after those sanctuaries closed, the one I was working at closed in about 1984, for the next 25 years I was working with people in the community, and some of them had actually been through that sanctuary. I'm going to start talking now about how, I guess this part of it that's a training of how to best be with someone in an extreme state. So from I Ward and Diabasis and Soteria and Kingsley Hall and all these places that provided these alternative approaches, I'm now, for the last several years, doing these trainings where I'm actually talking about responding with what I'm calling loving receptivity. And it was quite a choice to use that word love, especially someone who has a PhD in clinical psychology who never heard it once in 15 years of training. But it's based on my personal experience of being with my grandmother in that sanctuary, and then the kind of loving presence that came in and helped me. But also these sanctuaries, Lauren Mosier, before he passed away, Lauren and I co-led a workshop on alternative services. And we were basically saying the necessary and sufficient conditions when someone's in an extreme state, again, either acute or long-term, in my opinion, is the presence of at least one or a milieu where people are offering this heart-centered presence with them. And so in the trainings I do about that with therapists, I did one a while back where there were like 85 people there, and there was a lot of them were frontline therapists and mental health workers in Alameda County. And I thought, how is this going to go over? But it was very well received, because I think there's something that when we're really connecting with the people that we're present with, that is what's going on. And so I kind of came up with a way to get there subjectively, where the caregiver can be in that place, based on what my own needs were of trying to do it myself. So it may not work for everybody, it may seem silly, but I think it's got some value. First, there's a way of kind of unplugging from all the information we've learned about psychopathology and the medical model program that, not only us mental health people, but everyone in our culture. You can stop the person on the street and say, what is mental illness? And they'll tell you, almost all of them, it's some kind of genetic disease, brain disease, something. So the first step seems kind of simplistic, but it's almost like coming up with a temporary belief system that may not be right. Just imagine that an alternative vision, an alternative explanation could be possible that includes that this is a purposive process. It's something someone needs to go through. It's a natural, organic process, that it's definitely conditioned by all kinds of things that came before, traumas, losses, crises. There's this element of the spiritual, uncanny, mythic involved in it too. But it's not necessarily what psychiatry says it is. If we can kind of put that lens on and see it as an alternative experience, that prepares us then to be more receptive. And then if we're more receptive, then we're with someone where we're not running everything they're saying or doing through kind of the black box of the medical model. We're here in a kind of a naive state. And it turns out that in my experience, that state is a lot less cognitive. When I'm with someone who's in a very extreme state, like the young woman I told you about, or a young male who's very agitated and has been violent, and I'm, this far away from them in a room, my body needs to make some shifts for me to be there in the most present way. Like I make sure that I have my feet flat on the floor, and I try and loosen my breathing and be relaxing in my breathing, and I try and let my voice drop down into that lower register where I'm not like this, and I think what happens when we're with someone in these extreme states, if we're not kind of tracking subjectively what's going on with us, we contribute to their anxiety, or we contribute to their fear, or even them acting out. So going through this kind of checklist of where we are subjectively, and then that involves, again, since it's not so cognitive and rational and searching, kind of scrutinizing the person with that detached clinical gaze, we're more here. We're like if we were with a loved one that we're concerned about who's sick. Not that the person in an extreme state is sick, but when we're with someone, a child, a loved one who's suffering, is scared, that empathy, that compassion that comes when we're in this area where we're more in our emotion, that's where I've seen the connection really happen, when I can get out of my head and kind of be present with the person. And I'll give a couple of quick anecdotes about that. A friend of mine who was a psychiatric nurse worked in a state hospital, and she was taking care of a woman that had been catatonic for years. And it was her first time she'd had contact with this woman, and she was bathing her. And she felt her heart really open for the suffering of this woman. And she was bathing her in a very loving way. And the woman turned her head and looked up to her, and the first time she'd spoken in years, she said, "Mommy?" That kind of human connection that was so lacking for that person all those years. That was the breakthrough that happened, and I saw that over and over, especially after, for those 25 years and up till now. I'm still seeing people in extreme states every week. Being present with people in that way and not questioning them hardly at all or offering a bunch of my interpretations, just being present with them. Yeah, sometimes the person is ready and wanting to have a real engaged conversation, and it can be like that. But a lot of times I hear from people that I wish my parents or the therapist would stop asking me so damn many questions. It's like it's overwhelming, and they really want someone to be there in a receptive way. Maybe it seems almost too simplistic, but that's what I think really works from my experience. And then if you're with someone who's getting real agitated, they're in an extreme state and you're getting real agitated, there again, if we can stay grounded and stay open, the odds that they're going to pick up our energy and kind of where we're coming from is greatly increased. But if we start going like this and holding our breath and our voice goes up and we go like this, the other person's going to sense, we're mammals, right? We're these two mammals in this close space, and the other person's going to sense our fear, and that escalates their anxiety. So it's almost like an internal martial art, especially if someone is not heavily medicated. If when you're with people who are in these extreme states and it's in close proximity, it's really helpful, I believe, to be able to stay open like that with a compassionate heart. So I think I'm going to stop there and wish you all well for the rest of the conference and safe travels home. If you have any questions, feel free to contact me, Michael.Cornwall at att.net, Michael.Cornwall at att.net. I promise I'll respond. Thank you all.